Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week we have some news that we wanted to chat about, starting with the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. They adopted some new rules on Wednesday that require any companies that have gotten any cybersecurity breaches, they would have to disclose those within 4 days if they affect the bottom line. So delays can be permitted if there are any disclosures that might pose any national security risks or public safety risks. And under very extraordinary circumstances, a delay could be extended beyond 60 days. But for the most part, 4 days is the limit. And there is some wiggle room because technically the clock doesn't start running until the companies have determined a breach has happened. So companies could say, we didn't determine a breach until this day, and that's when our 4-day reporting window started, and that's when we have to report. So overall, I think this is a really good rule change. Adam and I talked about this a few months back when it was proposed rule, but now it has been voted on and is part of the SEC rules. So any publicly traded company has to abide by these. And so I think this will definitely make anyone who's traded cybersecurity will have a greater concern and priority within these companies.
Keep in mind who the Securities and Exchange Commission is protecting here are investors. Now, we all benefit as a result of that, but ultimately, this is not really for the greater good. This is not really for the benefit of the cybersecurity community. This is for the benefit of investors, so that if a breach is material, investors are notified so they can take appropriate action as far as selling a stock or making other decisions like that. So just want to keep in mind where this is really coming from and what's driving the need for it. It's become a problem to where companies are hiding this because of the risks of reputational damage and, yes, stock loss or stock value. I know I've worked for publicly traded companies, and they have always emphasized that they see cybersecurity risk as a potential detriment to that. So keep that in mind as far as where that's coming from. Now, all that said, this is a good thing. Not all companies are publicly traded. You probably engage with a lot of companies that are employee-owned, privately owned, held by private equity, and none of them are impacted by this. But the many large enterprises and corporations we interact with every day, many of them are publicly traded, and you'll now have a better sense of if they've been impacted because they have to share it within 4 days of determining that it is material. Now, I will tell you one thing. Also, as somebody who's worked for several publicly traded companies, you do not mess around with the Securities and Exchange Commission, by no means. And so this is one of those things where if you're sitting there as a cybersecurity pundit thinking, companies will find a way to skirt the rules or work around this. Quite the opposite. When something's left open to some interpretation, like 4 days from determining that it is material, when it comes to the SEC, companies will err on the side of caution instead of trying to protect themselves and risk fines and penalties. So you will see a much higher amount of public disclosure as a result of this rule passing. And that ultimately is a very good thing.
Yeah, more reporting will help, I think, lessons learned for other companies. As we do debriefs on what might have happened with this breach, it'll ultimately help bring up, maybe different solutions, different ways of protecting against certain attacks. All this stuff will come out more in the open, which overall is going to be a better environment for cybersecurity defenders.
Absolutely.
The next one I also found was really interesting. More government making more rules, but for the better, I think. Again, the FCC has a new set of proposed rules. This one isn't solidified yet. It hasn't been voted on, but they announced a new set of rules that they want to implement to guard against SIM swapping for consumers. And under these new proposed regulations, wireless providers would be required to adopt secure methods of authenticating a customer when they swap SIMs to a new device or port their number out to another carrier. Now, this has been a problem over the years. I think the major carriers have done a fairly decent job strengthening this over the years, but there's a ton of different conglomerates and smaller cell phone providers that maybe don't do this today. And under the new FCC, if they were continuing to operate, they would have to adopt these new rules. Additionally, they also have to notify customers when a SIM change or port out request is initiated. So that's on top of implementing a more secure way. The major cell phone providers adopted this new PIN authentication many years ago. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it is something else that you have to provide. I usually store mine in my password vault, but I think a couple of things. Some of them used to only require a 4-digit PIN. I think now a lot of them are more 6-digit PINs. You can go longer as well, and that if you are in security or have a vault, or even like my mother-in-law, I gave her just a notebook that she writes all of her stuff down in. Write down something that's longer. If you already have it recorded, you can have a longer PIN, and that would prevent someone from brute forcing it or guessing it, especially if like some of them used to default to like the last 4 of your social security number, which you can sometimes find in open source intelligence. Verizon uses an SMS with a link sent to it to authorize things, and I think they have some back intelligence on the telemetry of like what device it's being authorized on and all this other stuff to try to match. So you do have to have like physical control of your phone when you authorize someone into your account. So there are better ways of doing it. I don't think any of them are like OTP, one-time passcode level yet, but hopefully, at some point we're going to get to that. But this is a really good start with actual rules that are proposed by the FCC. Hopefully this goes into effect, and this will go a long ways into strengthening the SIM swapping attack, which can still definitely happen.
SIM swapping is definitely a risk inherent with any two-factor or multi-factor authentication that relies on the cellular providers to deliver them, whether that's a phone call or an SMS text message. That's why we advise against using those methodologies, is because you're now reliant on the security that those providers have to keep that a secure channel. Now, I think the carriers have stepped their game up here. And as you were reading through this, Andy, I just did a SIM swap on one of my lines over the weekend. So I was kind of following along with like what has T-Mobile, who is my provider, already implemented. So number one, they did have to send me a one-time passcode through an SMS to the account holder's main line to validate, which is something. And then they did notify me. They sent me an email and a text message telling me that that swap had taken place. So the notifications there is at least some advanced authentication around that. Although I'd still like to see more, because they didn't ask me any knowledge factors. It was solely a possession factor. It was single factor. It was, do you have the account holder's phone? So I still think there's work to do there. I would have liked to have proven some sort of knowledge factor, like provided my PIN along with the one-time passcode to my device. And I know if you do this in person in the stores, they are very particular about it. They check your ID very thoroughly. They've asked verbally to validate my account PIN code before proceeding. So I felt like this was a step backwards. I usually do most of my customer service with them through their, what they call T-Force, which is their Twitter DM support, which is really quite incredible. But there's more work to do here for sure. One other thing, I tried to do this self-service through their website, and they now have a page that pops up and says, we don't support self-service right now because we want to add additional security to the process. So call customer care or go into a store to do this. So anyhow, I think more to do. And certainly as cybersecurity professionals, we're interested in this because so many things rely on the security of cell phone providers to deliver those SMS or those phone calls safely. So we want to see that hardened throughout, because the weakest link introduces risk. And generally that has been customer care, social engineering, and the like.
And I think primarily outside of like enterprise, the majority of users still use SMS as multi-factor for their, Facebook or
Absolutely.
Instagram.
Yeah.
The majority of like non-cybersecurity folks are not going to go in and add, an app-based code. Mm-hmm. They're just going to have their phone number and they're going to get an SMS text. So still, if you're able to get someone's phone number, mm-hmm. you're able to access probably a lot of their accounts via multi-factor.
Absolutely. Well said. There is the tremendous benefit there for the consumer space of continuing to harden this. So I'm glad to see the FCC is pushing the carriers to do this. And like you said, I think the big three are doing an okay job here. I am sure it's more of the regional carriers, the prepaid carriers that are probably more at risk.
Another move by the FCC, some good things that they're doing, along with partnership with the Biden administration, they are launching a new certification and labeling program to help buyers and consumers identify which internet and Bluetooth connected devices meet federal cybersecurity requirements and are less vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks. Products that will meet this standard will get a certification mark or logo to be called the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark. And that certification mark will be very similar to the Energy Star logo that's found on energy efficient products that have, been applied to a lot of appliances, and that has been around for quite a while. But manufacturers will have to meet a fairly stringent cybersecurity criteria in order to certify their devices, and that will be published by NIST. And some of the examples might be like requiring unique and strong default passwords, data protection, encryption, software updates, incident detection capabilities. And this program's to be expected to be up and running by late 2024, and then you should start seeing those certification labels pop up. I think this is, again, a very good thing, especially when it comes to like IoT devices, right? Because it's not just phones. I think phones is definitely going to be part of it, but all of these other internet devices that we have connected, many of them are manufactured overseas. And so getting these manufacturers to volunteer to certify their devices, because this is a voluntary program, manufacturers don't have to be a part of it, but to be able to certify and get this, just an IoT camera having a strong unique default password, right? Instead of just admin password or something like that. So I think this is a great thing. It'll definitely help the consumers and even enterprises if you're picking out over-the-counter devices, what to pick if it's been certified or not.
As you were talking through this, my thought process went from skepticism when you first compared it to the Energy Star program to more enthusiasm over the course of you talking about it. Because ultimately, I don't know if I've ever shopped for anything and specifically sought out the Energy Star logo before making the buying decision. But energy efficiency is kind of on a different level of importance to cybersecurity. And by the way, before you fire off an angry tweet or email, I'm not saying I don't support that. I'm just saying, like, in the past, especially, I think as we've become more conscious about it, we'll notice it more going forward. But in the past, I don't think that really influenced a lot of our buying decisions of, well, I want to make sure this is energy efficient before I buy it. Other than things like appliances, like, yes, I want an efficient refrigerator and an air conditioner, but I'm not looking for that when I go buy a new TV. Anyhow, that said, I like the idea of a one-stop shop to be able to point muggles at. Muggles being people who are non-technical, don't really focus on technology. For me to be able to say to, for example, my mother, hey, if you're going to go shop for a new Wi-Fi camera, just make sure it's got this logo on it before you pick one out. That'd be great. Like, that's easy to do. And I think that really helps up our game. And love that NIST is involved, and this is going to rely on standards published by NIST that have to be met in order to comply with this. So overall, I think it's a win. I think also, as I often say, a rising tide lifts all ships. And so there's that organic, quote unquote, peer pressure for organizations to rise to the challenge of each other. And so if most companies in that space are going to have the US Cyber Trust mark on it, it encourages others to do it as well. So again, I think a win. It's going to create a kind of a base level expectation of cybersecurity in a lot of these products. And it is crazy. I think most of our listeners are technologists and folks who probably already have a lot of those OT devices in their home. However, I'm noticing that even again in the homes of muggles, they are starting to collect a fair amount of IoT and OT devices too. I was just at my mother's house helping her migrate to a new Wi-Fi network and manually reconnecting all her devices. And I became rather astounded at how many non-smartphone, non-tablet, non-computer type devices there were to help migrate over. It's a lot. And a lot of them were old and some of them were, awkward dance to move them over to a new network. And it highlights the benefit, the opportunity here that this mark could really make. So I'm for it. I think this is a great thing. And ultimately, this was one of those kind of latent, unrealized risks that has been growing over recent times. And if you look at the proliferation of like Amazon Prime Day, and you look at like Temu coming on the scene now as shopping sites, and you look at how, again, not using this word derisively, but muggles shop for things, they shop on cost and price. And they're not always looking for, is it the most secure? Is it the best thing? It's just like, well, this thing is cheap and it's on Amazon, so I'm going to buy it. And I think of deep concerns about the cybersecurity posture of those devices. So they may not get better, but maybe this will be enough of a groupthink effort or that rising tide that even all devices in a class start to comply with this. Fingers crossed.
And I think when you're talking about the energy efficient, like the Energy Star, honestly, I never used it as a decision-making point, but also I don't think that any appliance that I ever looked at didn't have it on it. Like I think if you just go to like a Best Buy or some appliance store and you look, they're all Energy Star certified. And so at some point, it's just a moot point. Like everything has it. And so I'm hoping in this case, right, like you said, whether it's peer pressure or maybe it's capitalist based where, we start buying those products with it. And then the manufacturers are like, oh, well, the only ones that are selling are the ones with this US Cyber Trust on it. So let's just make everything US Cyber Trust. I think hopefully at some point, everything will migrate in that direction.
Exactly. You articulated it better than me. Exactly that. The Energy Star logo today is ubiquitous. I don't think you can buy an appliance without it. I would love to see to the point where you can't buy an IoT device without this.
Exactly. Our final bit of news that I wanted to chat about is this press release that was through Samsung. And they announced the partnership with Microsoft, which has been around for a long time. Samsung and Microsoft have had this partnership, but this new capability that they are releasing about mobile device security. And so now between Microsoft and Samsung, there is this collaboration where it has the first on-device mobile hardware-backed device attestation solution that will work on both company-owned and personally owned devices. And so that on-device mobile hardware-backed device attestation, it's available on Samsung Galaxy devices, and it combines with Intune to provide that extra layer of protection against devices that might be compromised and falsely claiming that they are known and healthy to try to gain access to sensitive corporate data. And additionally, organizations can allow employees to bring their own device and it'll have the same level of protection as the company-owned devices, which means that you just get that more flexibility. Samsung Knox is the mobile security that's built into Galaxy devices. It's 10 years old. It's extremely mature. It has like moment of first boot security protecting against hardware and firmware attacks, and it has a separate Knox container where users can store business data separate from personal data, making BYOD appealing. And I found out that the NSA actually approved Samsung Knox for storage of classified data, which makes it the first app of its kind to be approved by the NSA to do this. So all in all, I mean, this is obviously a very good change, and not that I think Samsung has the best phones out there. And if you're a listener of the show, you know that Adam and I are also big fans of Apple, but I think Samsung's a great company. I think they make great devices. Android has a lot of capabilities, especially with Samsung Knox. This has been around and been integrated with Intune for a very long time. In fact, as long as I can remember, essentially the corporate owned devices that you could obtain through a supplier could be onboarded into Samsung Knox and provide that quote unquote like autopilot experience with device profiles built in specifically for corporate use only. So when it comes to Android devices, there are personally owned and corporate managed, as well as corporate owned and managed devices. And then when you're corporate owned through Samsung Knox, you have a much more granular level of policies that you can apply and kind of lock it down even more. So with Knox and Intune, for having that on-device attestation, I think it's pretty powerful and a great win for security as well.
So this is an interesting announcement. I'd like to unpack it more and dig into it more in the future. But kind of my initial thoughts on hearing about this, and I saw this come across the wire earlier this week. The industry's first on-device mobile hardware-backed device attestation solution that works equally well on both company and personally owned devices. I'm not sure what part of that is industry's first. There's a lot of words there following industry's first, so it's not clear what part of it they're saying is industry first. What it sounds like they're doing, based on my unpacking of the press release, is being able to prove out that cryptographic chain of trust all the way to the boot of the device, which Windows PCs do today, Mac OS devices do today, and iOS devices do today. So again, I'm not sure what's new about that. It might be specifically, new to Android, being a little less familiar with Android's kind of chain of trust as far as it relates to, the boot bootloader and being able to trust everything all the way down. Because what it sounds like they're saying is, devices could potentially be owned, but because they're owned at such a low level, they could falsely report that, hey, I'm compliant, I'm secure, everything's good, when really it's not. And that's because you may have malware at a low enough level that it's undetectable at the OS level. And what they're saying is because you'd have, I assume, cryptographic trust, if any of that gets modified at any point, it would fail the cryptographic check and would not attest as being, safe. I know Knox has done other things in the past, like they've extended the Android operating system and added additional capabilities above and beyond the management capabilities native to Android. And it sounds like they're even doing some sort of like secure enclave, similar to maybe like TPM as an example, where you can store data as well. So Knox, of course, is the brand that encompasses all of these different solutions. But this is definitely interesting. And having the support built into Intune basically from the moment this starts shipping is really powerful. And Samsung has enjoyed a history, putting on my old hat when I used to be a mobile device management specialist in enterprise IT. I initially proposed that we should only allow Samsung devices for Android because they had a certain level of manageability above and beyond every other provider. And we saw that in practice where managing like LG devices or Motorola devices was not to the same caliber. I think that's mostly been made a moot point with the Android Enterprise suite of capabilities, but still, it's interesting to see that Samsung continues to invest in this space for sure. So definitely very, very interesting. I think anyone who runs a highly secure environment and wants to ensure your mobile devices are highly secure, this is a great option on the Android side of the world. I would argue this does not offer anything above and beyond what Apple already does because they have cryptographic trust all the way to the silicon level when their operating system boots. Like it's not like you can go load any arbitrary OS on an iPhone or anything like that. And it's not like you wouldn't pick up on it being modified. But again, like the attestation isn't necessarily there for the iPhone to say, yes, I am secure all the way down. And that might be what they're doing that's world's first or industry's first. Anyhow, this is a good thing, right? Ultimately, when everyone's upping their game, everybody wins. And I think Apple has mostly owned the space on being the most secure mobile platform for many, many years. And Android's kind of taken it in second place. And so here's Samsung again trying to continue to invest in the Android ecosystem, continue to up that security game. That's a win. That's a total win. So I'm excited to learn more about this. But my initial response to it is this is positive. This is interesting and good on Samsung for continuing to invest in this space.
I think you're on the right track, Adam, in your speculation on how it works, because with Windows attestation, that is built into like Intune's compliance policies. And so you can use essentially a cloud attestation server to make sure that upon boot, the trusted code is being loaded into your device. And then that gets translated and reported back to Intune and it says, hey, we have a good device, right? From boot. This, I think, is the same thing with Samsung, and it's going to report that device attestation health back to Intune, where it's saying, hey, like we have our own service. We're making sure that the code is running correct from a kernel level. That gets reported back. Not to say that Apple doesn't do that, but there is no integration to report a device level attestation health.
Exactly.
Right? Back
As
to
I
Intune.
kind of talked through it, I kind of found myself there was you can't get the iPhone to say, yes, I am, even though it's assumed because that's the security model, you can't attest it, right?
Correct.
And I think that's what you're talking about here. And I think the comparison to the Windows Secure Boot is the good comparison because that, like you said, you can run an Intune compliance policy to check for that and validate that the device has gone through Windows Secure Boot, which means everything's cryptographically trusted.
Correct. And I think Samsung has their own way of checking that and then reporting it with integration into Intune. And same thing with macOS, right? macOS has that same model of trust, but it doesn't have that reporting factor over to your solution that you can scope a conditional access policy to say if this device is compliant based on the device health attestation reported back from the manufacturer, which I think is very powerful. If I can get outside of Windows, because Windows has always been there. It's been there for a long time, but now we're able to scope mobile device health attestation from non-Microsoft devices. I think that's a win. It's definitely a great thing. Just that extra level of security for, folks that are in highly secure environments. You really need to know if your mobile device is compromised or not.
Yeah. And that's where nation state attacks are going to live, right? They're going to be above and beyond just like attacking the operating system. They're going to attack at a lower level than that, where they can behave more undetected. And again, like the system could say, yeah, everything's cool, when it's really not.
Yeah. Exactly. Good stuff here. Some news that if you, haven't followed along or missed it, I found all of these really interesting and really good for the overall cybersecurity within organizations and just in the industry itself. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.